The morning sun cast long shadows across Range 7 as Sergeant Maya Chun approached the shooting line with her gear bag slung over one shoulder. The qualification day roster had her name penciled in at the bottom, squeezed between two crossed-out entries like an afterthought. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his clipboard, squinting against the glare as he took in her small frame and the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. "Can you even shoot?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying just loud enough for the three other instructors to hear. The question hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, drawing curious glances from the soldiers already positioned in nearby lanes. Chun set down her bag without breaking eye contact, her expression remaining neutral despite the obvious challenge in his tone. Corporal Davies chuckled from behind the scoring table, tapping his pen against the metal surface. "We got another one thinks she can handle the advanced course," he said to his partner. Sergeant Williams shook his head slowly, already reaching for the remedial training forms that seemed to multiply like weeds in his filing cabinet. The legendary range record board dominated the wall behind the instructor station, its brass nameplate gleaming under the fluorescent lights. 15 years had passed since Master Sergeant Thompson achieved his perfect score of 400 points, a feat that had become mythical among the soldiers who trained here. Every few months someone would glance at those numbers and wonder if perfection could ever be matched, let alone exceeded. Chun began unpacking her equipment with methodical precision, each piece finding its designated place on the wooden bench. Her rifle case opened with a soft click, revealing a weapon that appeared unremarkable to the casual observer. Rodriguez moved closer, his experienced eye noting the subtle modifications and the way she handled each component with the familiarity of countless hours of practice. 23 attempts this year alone, Davies muttered to Williams, reviewing his logbook entries. Not one shooter has even come close to breaking 350. These new transfers always think they can waltz in here and rewrite history. Williams nodded in agreement, his attention divided between the conversation and watching Chun adjust her scope with minute precision. The morning wind had settled to almost nothing, creating ideal conditions that made Rodriguez slightly nervous. Perfect weather had a way of giving shooters false confidence, leading them to attempt shots beyond their actual capability. He had seen too many promising soldiers destroy their confidence by aiming too high too soon. Other soldiers began gathering behind the firing line, drawn by the familiar tension that preceded ambitious attempts. Word traveled fast in the close quarters of military life, and the prospect of watching someone fail spectacularly always drew an audience. Chun seemed oblivious to the growing crowd, her focus entirely consumed by the technical preparation required for precision shooting. Rodriguez checked his watch and called for positions, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. The qualification course would begin with standard distances before progressing to the extreme ranges where legends were made or destroyed. Chun moved to her assigned lane, her movements economical and practiced. "What brings you to our neck of the woods anyway?" Rodriguez asked, genuinely curious about this soldier who seemed so different from the usual transfers. The question prompted several people to lean closer, eager to hear her background and credentials. The answer would have to wait as the first commands echoed across the range. But Rodriguez found himself studying her stance and grip with increased attention. Something about her preparation suggested she might be more than another overconfident transfer. Though 15 years of watching shooters attempt the impossible had taught him to temper his expectations. The story of Master Sergeant Thompson's legendary 400-point score had become the stuff of base folklore, retold with the reverence usually reserved for war heroes. 15 years ago, he had stepped up to this very line during a qualification session that started as routine as any other. The weather conditions that day had been perfect, with zero wind and clear visibility extending beyond the furthest targets. Williams pulled out his worn notebook where he recorded every attempt at breaking the record, the pages filled with disappointed scores and bitter lessons. Thompson's achievement represented mathematical perfection under the current scoring system, requiring hits in the exact center of every target at distances ranging from 200 to 800 meters. The margin for error measured in millimeters rather than inches. Davies gestured toward the memorial plaque mounted beside the record board, honoring Thompson, who had died in Afghanistan 3 years after setting his mark. The man was a machine, Davies explained to a young private who had never heard the complete story. Never missed a qualification, never scored below 380, and that final day, he just decided to show everyone what perfect looked like. Chun continued her methodical preparation, apparently unmoved by the legendary tale being recounted for her benefit. She had inserted foam earplugs and begun her breathing exercises, the kind of pre-shooting ritual that separated serious marksmen from weekend enthusiasts. Rodriguez noticed her complete focus and found himself reconsidering his initial assessment. The shooting lanes stretched out before them like a mathematical equation written in steel and concrete. Each distance marker represented an exponential increase in difficulty, with the final 800-meter targets appearing as mere dots against the earthen backstop. Thompson had put every single round through the center ring at that distance, something that defied the limitations of standard military ammunition. Corporal Martinez approached from the ammunition depot, pushing a cart loaded with the day's allotment of match-grade rounds. These cartridges cost nearly 10 times more than standard ball ammunition, justified only by the importance of accurate qualification scores. Chin inspected several cartridges with a jeweler's attention to detail, checking for consistency in weight and appearance. The growing crowd of observers included several sergeants who remembered Thompson personally, their faces carrying the mixture of pride and skepticism that accompanied discussions of the untouchable record. Private Jensen whispered to his squad, made about rumors that Thompson had possessed almost supernatural shooting ability, stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Rodriguez called for the first relay to take their positions, his voice carrying across the range with practiced authority. The standard qualification began at 200 meters with 10 rounds fired from the prone position, a distance where even average shooters could achieve respectable scores. Chun settled into her firing position with fluid grace, her body alignment textbook perfect. The first command rang out sharp and clear, initiating the sequence that would either validate Chin's quiet confidence or add another disappointing entry to Williams' notebook. Around the range, conversations died as attention focused on the shooting line where dreams of greatness regularly met the harsh reality of physics and human limitation. Chin's breathing had settled into the rhythmic pattern that preceded precision shooting, each exhale bringing her closer to the moment of truth. The rifle nestled against her shoulder as if it belonged there, the scope aligned with mathematical precision. Behind her, Rodriguez found himself holding his breath despite years of experience watching qualifications. The 200-meter targets waited in perfect stillness, their scoring rings clearly visible in the morning light. This opening distance served as both warm-up and confidence builder, though Chen treated it with the same careful attention she would give to any shot. Her finger found the trigger with practiced familiarity, applying pressure with the patience of someone who understood that rushing guaranteed failure. Davies glanced at his stopwatch, noting the deliberate pace that marked experienced shooters. Chen showed none of the nervous energy that plagued most qualification attempts, her movements controlled and purposeful. The first shot would tell them everything they needed to know about whether this quiet soldier deserved their attention or merely their sympathy. The official range session commenced with the sharp blast of Rodriguez's whistle, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Chen's first shot cracked across the range with authority, the sound echoing off the concrete barriers that lined each firing lane. The spotters immediately focused their scopes downrange, searching for the telltale paper tear that would reveal her accuracy. Perfect Center called Williams from behind his spotting scope, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he tried to suppress. The first shot had punched through the exact middle of the target, leaving a clean hole surrounded by undisturbed scoring rings. Davies made a notation on a scorecard, the number 10 appearing at the top of what would become a very interesting column. Chen cycled her bolt with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent brass that clinked against the concrete beside her shooting mat. The second shot followed within 30 seconds, another clean break that sent the bullet downrange toward its distant target. Rodriguez found himself watching her technique with increased attention, noting the way she managed recoil and maintained her sight picture. The 200-meter phase continued with metronomic regularity, each shot finding its mark with the consistency of a machine. Chen's breathing never varied from the established pattern, her body position remaining rock-solid despite the hard concrete surface beneath her prone form. The growing stack of perfect scores on Davy's clipboard began to attract worried glances from the instructor team. 10 shots, 10 perfect hits, Rodriguez announced as the first phase concluded. Chun rose from her position and began preparing for the transition to 300 meters, her movements economical and practiced. The crowd behind the firing line had grown noticeably larger, word having spread through the base that something unusual was developing on Range 7. The 300-meter targets appeared smaller but remained clearly visible in the morning light. Chun adjusted her scope elevation with precise clicks, each mechanical adjustment calculated to compensate for the increased distance and bullet drop. The mathematics of long-range shooting required intimate knowledge of ballistics, atmospheric conditions, and equipment capabilities. Williams updated the range condition board with current wind speed and direction, though the morning remained remarkably still. Perfect shooting weather created opportunities, but also eliminated excuses for poor performance. Chun seemed unaffected by either the ideal conditions or the mounting pressure from her flawless start. The second phase began with the same whistle blast that had initiated the session. Chun settled into her firing position with practiced ease, the rifle finding its familiar place against her shoulder. The 300-meter distance represented the point where average shooters began to struggle, where small errors in technique became magnified in missed targets. Rodriguez counted the seconds between shots, noting the consistent rhythm that marked disciplined shooters. Chun never rushed her firing sequence, taking the time necessary to ensure proper sight alignment and trigger control. Each shot followed the same deliberate process that had produced perfection at the shorter distance. The spotters called out scores with increasing amazement as perfect hits continued to accumulate on the scoreboard. 20 shots fired, 20 perfect hits recorded, a performance that was beginning to approach the realm of the impossible. Davies found himself double-checking his arithmetic, unable to believe the numbers accumulating in front of him. Chun transitioned smoothly to the 400-meter phase, the distance where many qualified marksmen reached their effective limit. The targets had shrunk to challenging proportions, requiring precise holdover calculations and flawless execution. The crowd of observers had grown to include several officers who rarely visited the shooting ranges during routine qualifications. The rifle cracked repeatedly as Chun worked through the 400-meter sequence, each shot delivered with the same controlled precision that had characterized her performance from the beginning. The spotters continued calling perfect hits while Davies accumulated scores that defied probability and experience. Rodriguez found himself wondering if he was witnessing something that would redefine what seemed possible on his range. 30 perfect shots, Williams announced as the 400-meter phase concluded. The scoreboard showed a number that had never appeared during Rodriguez's tenure as range master, a performance that was tracking toward mathematical impossibility. Chun began preparing for the 500-meter distance, apparently unaware that she was approaching legendary territory with every trigger pull. The 500-meter targets presented a formidable challenge that separated competent shooters from true marksmen. At this distance, the scoring rings appeared as thin lines barely visible through rifle scopes, requiring precise adjustment for bullet drop and wind drift. Chun studied the range flags hanging motionless in the still air before making minute corrections to her scope settings. "She's got to miss eventually," Davies muttered to Williams while updating the scoreboard with another row of perfect tens. The laws of probability suggested that maintaining perfection across increasing distances defied mathematical possibility. Even Thompson had recorded several 9-point hits during his legendary run, making Chen's unbroken string of perfect scores increasingly surreal. Rodriguez announced the 500-meter phase with his characteristic whistle blast, though his voice carried less certainty than it had during the morning's opening commands. Chen settled into her firing position with the same methodical approach that had characterized every previous shot, her breathing settling into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting. The first shot at 500 meters cracked across the range with authority, the bullet's flight time noticeably longer as it arced toward the distant target. Williams focused his spotting scope with intense concentration, searching the target face for the impact point that would either continue the impossible streak or return the session to normal parameters. "Dead center again," Williams called out, his voice betraying frustration with his inability to spot any flaw in Chen's technique. The shot had punched through the exact middle of his ring, maintaining the perfect score that was beginning to attract attention from base command. Major Patterson had appeared on the observation deck, his binoculars trained on the shooting line. Chen continued working through the 500-meter sequence with machine-like consistency, each shot preceded by the same careful preparation and followed by another perfect hit. The rifle seemed to be an extension of her body, responding to minute adjustments with precision that defied the limitations of standard military equipment. Davies found himself questioning whether her ammunition might be specially prepared, though regulations prohibited such modifications during qualification. The crowd behind the firing line had grown to include nearly 50 spectators, their conversations creating a low murmur that violated the usual range discipline. Rodriguez considered ordering them to maintain silence, but found himself equally captivated by the unfolding performance. Chen appeared oblivious to the attention, her focus entirely concentrated on the technical demands of long-range shooting. 40 perfect shots, Williams announced as the 500-meter phase concluded. The scoreboard displayed numbers that challenged everything Rodriguez thought he knew about shooting limitations. Chen rose from her firing position and began preparing for the 600-meter distance, the point where Thompson's record had begun to show occasional imperfection. The 600-meter targets appeared as mere specks against the earthen backstop, requiring maximum magnification to distinguish the scoring rings. At this distance, atmospheric conditions became critical factors, with minor temperature variations capable of shifting bullet impact by several inches. Chen studied her data book with the concentration of an engineer reviewing blueprint specifications. Major Patterson descended from the observation deck and approached Rodriguez with obvious concern. "This performance is unprecedented," Patterson said quietly, his eyes fixed on the scoreboard that was rewriting range history. Rodriguez nodded in agreement, while secretly hoping that Chen would maintain her perfect pace long enough to obliterate Thompson's untouchable record. The 600-meter phase began with the same whistle command that had initiated each previous distance. Chen's rifle found its familiar position against her shoulder as she prepared to challenge the outer limits of what seemed humanly possible. The spotters adjusted their scopes to maximum magnification, determined to catch any flaw that might explain her extraordinary accuracy. Chen's first shot at 600 meters sailed downrange with the same authority that had characterized every previous round. The bullet's extended flight time created suspense that hadn't existed at shorter distances, giving observers time to consider the mathematical impossibility of what they were witnessing. Williams trained his spotting scope on the distant target with nervous anticipation. "Another perfect center hit," Williams called out, though his voice now carried disbelief rather than surprise. The shot had maintained Chen's flawless record despite the increased difficulty, suggesting that 600 meters represented no greater challenge than the shorter distances had posed. Davies updated the scoreboard with growing amazement, the accumulated perfect scores approaching Thompson's total achievement. The completion of the 600-meter phase brought Chen's score to 60 perfect hits, a performance that had transcended impressive and entered the realm of the impossible. Major Patterson pulled Rodriguez aside while Chen prepared for the 700-meter distance, his expression mixing amazement with bureaucratic concern about documentation requirements for record-breaking performances. "We need to verify her equipment before she continues," Patterson said quietly, though his tone suggested he expected to find nothing irregular. Chun overheard the request and nodded toward her rifle case, inviting inspection of the weapon that was rewriting range history. Rodriguez examined the rifle with practiced hands, finding only standard military components arranged with exceptional care. Davies had stopped updating the scoreboard automatically, now double-checking each entry against his backup scorecard to ensure accuracy. The numbers refused to change despite repeated verification, confirming that Chun had achieved mathematical perfection across 6 different distances. Williams periodically cleaned his spotting scope lens, convinced that equipment malfunction must explain his inability to spot any flawed shots. The 700-meter targets pushed the boundaries of what standard military rifles could achieve with consistency. At this extreme distance, minor variations in ammunition weight or atmospheric density could shift bullet impact by inches, making perfect accuracy a matter of statistical impossibility rather than mere difficulty. Chun studied her ballistic charts with the concentration of a scientist reviewing experimental data. Colonel Morrison arrived from base headquarters accompanied by the range safety officer, their presence indicating that Chun's performance had attracted attention from the highest levels of command. Morrison positioned himself behind the spotting scopes where he could personally verify each shot, his reputation for demanding accuracy making him the ideal witness for unprecedented achievements. "She cannot maintain this pace much longer," Morrison observed to Patterson, though his voice carried hope rather than certainty. The colonel had served with Thompson during the legendary Master Sergeant's peak years, making him uniquely qualified to appreciate the magnitude of what Chun was attempting. His presence lent official weight to proceedings that had begun as routine qualification. Chun settled into her firing position for the 700-meter phase, her movements retaining the fluid precision that had characterized every previous shot. The rifle nestled against her shoulder with familiar comfort while she adjusted her scope for the extreme distance. The crowd of observers had grown to include nearly the entire day shift, their conversations creating an unusual atmosphere of anticipation. The first shot at 700 meters cracked across the range with authority that defied the mathematical challenges of extreme distance shooting. Chun's follow-throw remained textbook perfect, her eye never leaving the scope as she cycled the bolt for the next round. Williams focused his spotting scope with intense concentration, searching for any sign that perfection might finally be challenged. "Incredible," Williams called out after locating the bullet hole. Dead center at 700 meters. The shot had punched through the exact middle of his ring despite atmospheric conditions that should have introduced measurable error. Morrison shook his head in amazement, while Davies added another perfect score to the ever-growing column of tens. Chun continued through the 700-meter sequence with a methodical approach that had produced 60 consecutive perfect hits. Each shot followed the same deliberate process of sight alignment, breathing control, and trigger squeeze that had become as reliable as clockwork. The rifle seemed to respond to her intent rather than mere mechanical input, producing accuracy that transcended equipment limitations. The completion of Phase 7 brought Chun's total to 70 perfect shots, a score that had surpassed Thompson's achievement in consistency, if not total points. Morrison consulted his pocket calculator while reviewing the scoring requirements, confirming that mathematical perfection through 800 meters would establish a new record that might never be challenged. Rodriguez announced preparation for the final 800-meter phase, his voice carrying reverence usually reserved for ceremonial occasions. Chun began her final equipment checks with the same careful attention that had preceded every previous distance, apparently unaffected by the pressure of approaching immortality. The 800-meter targets appeared as mere dots against the distant backstop, barely visible even through maximum scope magnification. The gathered crowd fell silent as Chun prepared for the ultimate test of marksmanship skill. 800 meters represented the outer limit of what standard military ammunition could achieve with reliability, requiring perfect execution of every technical element. Morrison positioned himself directly behind the primary spotting scope, determined to personally verify whatever happened next. The 800-meter distance represented the pinnacle of military marksmanship, where atmospheric physics conspired against human precision and standard ammunition reached its practical limits. Chun studied the range conditions one final time, noting the barely perceptible heat shimmer rising from the concrete firing positions as morning temperatures climbed toward their midday peak. Morrison established himself behind the primary spotting scope, while Patterson coordinated with the range safety officer to ensure proper documentation of whatever transpired. The base photographer arrived with professional equipment, tasked with capturing images of a performance that was already being discussed in terms of military legend. Chun appeared entirely focused on her technical preparation, immune to the growing circus surrounding her achievement. The 800-meter targets had been constructed to military specifications that anticipated competent shooting rather than perfection, their scoring rings sized for realistic accuracy expectations. Thompson's legendary performance had included several 9-point hits at this distance, making his 400-point total seem like the absolute ceiling of human capability. Chin's 70 consecutive perfect shots had already redefined what seemed possible. Rodriguez checked his chronometer and prepared to announce the final phase, though his usual confidence had given way to nervous anticipation. The morning had transformed from routine qualification into something approaching military history, with Chun positioned to obliterate records that had stood for 15 years. Williams cleaned his spotting scope lens repeatedly, determined to provide accurate observation of shots that would be discussed for decades. Chun settled into her final firing position with the same methodical precision that had characterized every previous phase. The rifle found its familiar place against her shoulder while she made minute adjustments to account for the extreme distance and subtle atmospheric changes. Her breathing pattern remained unchanged despite the magnitude of what she was attempting to accomplish. The crowd had grown to include virtually every off-duty soldier on base, their presence creating an atmosphere more appropriate for sporting events than military qualification. Morrison ordered the observers to maintain absolute silence during the shooting phase, recognizing that external distractions could derail even the most focused marksman. Chun began her final sight picture verification, the culmination of preparation that had consumed the entire morning. Rodriguez raised his whistle for the command that would initiate the most critical phase of an already extraordinary performance. The 800-meter distance would either cement Chin's place in military history or demonstrate the limits that eventually constrained even exceptional shooters. Morrison positioned his eye behind the spotting scope with the intensity of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. The whistle blast echoed across range 7 with finality that seemed to suspend time itself. Chin's breathing settled into the familiar pattern while she aligned her crosshairs with mathematical precision. The first shot at 800 meters would begin her assault on perfection itself, testing whether human skill could overcome the physical laws that govern extreme distance shooting. Her finger found the trigger with practiced familiarity, applying pressure with the patience that separated true marksmen from enthusiastic amateurs. The rifle remained perfectly steady despite the psychological pressure of attempting something that had never been achieved in military history. Around the range, every observer held their breath in unconscious sympathy with the shooter. The shot cracked across the range with authority that defied the challenges of extreme distance, the bullet beginning its long arc toward a target that appeared impossibly small through rifle scopes. Morrison tracked the projectile's flight time, while Williams prepared to call out the impact location that would either continue the impossible streak or bring Chun back to Earth with mathematical reality. The flight time at 800 meters created suspense unknown at shorter distances, giving observers opportunity to contemplate the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Chun maintained her firing position with unwavering stability, her eye never leaving the scope as she prepared for immediate follow-up if conditions permitted. The moment stretched toward eternity as physics and human skill converged at the distant target. Williams focused his spotting scope with maximum magnification, searching the target face for the bullet hole that would determine whether perfection could be sustained across the ultimate test of marksmanship skill. The silence stretched across the range like a held breath, broken only by the distant flutter of range flags and air currents too subtle to affect shooting conditions. "Perfect center hit at 800 meters," Williams announced, his voice barely concealing the disbelief that had been building throughout the morning. The bullet had punched through the exact middle of his ring despite atmospheric conditions that should have introduced measurable deviation. Morrison verified the call through his own spotting scope, confirming what seemed impossible even as he witnessed it personally. Chen cycled her bolt with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent brass that represented shot number 71 in an unbroken string of perfection. The second shot at 800 meters followed within 45 seconds, another clean break that sent the projectile on its long journey toward the distant target. Davies updated his scoreboard with growing amazement, the accumulated perfect scores approaching mathematical impossibility. "She's going to break 400, Patterson whispered to Morrison, though both men understood they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple record. Chen's performance had transcended Thompson's legendary achievement in consistency, maintaining perfection across distances where even the master sergeant had accepted occasional imperfection. The implications for military marksmanship training would be discussed for years. The crowd behind the firing line had organized itself into informal ranks, with senior officers positioned nearest the shooting positions and enlisted personnel arranged by seniority. The unusual gathering violated normal range protocols, but Morrison recognized that exceptional circumstances warranted flexible interpretation of standard procedures. History was being written in real time on Range 7. Chun continued through the 800-meter sequence with unwavering focus, each shot delivered with the same controlled precision that had characterized her performance from the beginning. The rifle seemed to respond to her intent rather than mechanical manipulation, producing accuracy that challenged fundamental assumptions about equipment limitations. Rodriguez found himself questioning whether he was dreaming or witnessing actual events. "Another perfect 10, Williams called out after the fifth shot at 800 meters. Chen's technique remained flawless despite the mounting pressure of approaching an unprecedented achievement. Her breathing never varied from the established pattern, her body position maintaining rock-solid stability on the concrete firing pad. The accumulated stress of 75 consecutive perfect shots seemed to have no effect on her performance. Morrison consulted his calculation sheet while tracking Chen's progress toward the magical 400-point threshold. Thompson's record had included 6 shots, scoring 9 points, making his total seem like the absolute ceiling of human achievement. Chen's unbroken string of perfect 10s had already surpassed that consistency by significant margins, redefining what qualified marksmen consider possible. The base commander arrived from headquarters accompanied by the public affairs officer, their presence indicating that Chen's performance had attracted attention from levels far above normal range operations. Colonel Bradley positioned himself where he could observe both the shooting and the official documentation, recognizing that proper verification would be crucial for any record claims. The photographer continued, capturing images of the historic session. Chun prepared for her final shots at 800 meters, the completion of which would establish a new standard for military marksmanship that might never be equaled. Her equipment checks followed the same methodical pattern that had preceded every distance, though the stakes had escalated far beyond routine qualification. The rifle nestled against her shoulder with familiar comfort as she prepared to attempt perfection one final time. The mathematical probability of maintaining perfect scores across all distances approached statistical impossibility, yet Chen had demonstrated that exceptional skill could overcome theoretical limitations. Morrison calculated that her current pace would produce a score exceeding 420 points, a total that would shatter existing records by margins that defied precedent. The witnesses were observing redefinition of human potential in real time. Rodriguez prepared to announce the final shots of the 800-meter phase, his voice carrying reverence appropriate for momentous occasions. Chen's breathing settled into the familiar rhythm while she verified her sight picture against the distant target. The moment had arrived to complete something that had never been achieved in military history, requiring perfect execution under maximum pressure. The silence across Range 7 approached absolute as Chen prepared for the shots that would either cement her legendary status or demonstrate that even exceptional performers eventually encountered limits. Morrison positioned himself for optimal observation of the final phase, determined to provide accurate witness testimony for achievements that would be analyzed and discussed throughout military marksmanship communities. The completion of the 800-meter phase brought Chen's total to 80 perfect shots, a performance that had obliterated every assumption about the limits of military marksmanship. Colonel Bradley consulted with Morrison about official documentation requirements, while Davies triple-checked his scoreboard against backup records. The numbers remained constant despite repeated verification, confirming achievements that challenged fundamental beliefs about human capability. Chen rose from her firing position and began cleaning her rifle with the same methodical attention that had characterized her shooting technique. The weapon appeared unremarkable despite producing results that defied explanation, leading Morrison to wonder whether exceptional skill could transform ordinary equipment into instruments of perfection. The base armor was summoned to conduct detailed inspection of components that had just rewritten military history. Standard qualification protocols called for immediate scoring and documentation, but Chen's performance had transcended normal procedures. Bradley authorized extended verification time, while the range staff confirmed target measurements and calculated point totals that exceeded existing records by unprecedented margins. The official score of 400 points represented mathematical perfection under current military standards. Rodriguez gathered his instructor team to discuss what they had witnessed, though adequate words seemed inadequate for describing the morning's events. Davies compared his scorecard entries against Williams' backup documentation while searching for any error that might explain the impossible consistency. The numbers refused to change despite intensive scrutiny, confirming that they had observed something beyond normal human limitation. The crowd of witnesses had grown to include nearly 300 soldiers, their presence creating logistical challenges for range operations, but providing unprecedented verification for historic achievements. Bradley recognized that proper documentation would require detailed statements from multiple observers, transforming routine qualification into formal investigation of extraordinary claims. The public affairs officer began coordinating media response protocols. Chun completed her equipment cleaning and began packing her gear with the same careful attention that had marked every aspect of her preparation. The rifle case closed with a soft click, containing the weapon that had just established new standards for military accuracy. Morrison approached with official scoring documents that would need to be forwarded through multiple command levels for verification and recognition. The armorer completed his inspection without finding any irregular modifications or illegal enhancements that might explain Chen's extraordinary performance. Standard military ammunition had produced results that challenged the physical limitations of both equipment and human skill, suggesting that exceptional technique could overcome theoretical boundaries. The implications for marksmanship training programs would be analyzed for years. Bradley authorized immediate notification of higher headquarters while coordinating with range personnel to preserve all documentation related to the historic session. Chen's performance had exceeded Thompson's legendary record by margins that required official investigation and verification through proper military channels. The photographer continued documenting evidence that would support formal record claims. Williams reviewed his spotting notes while confirming that every shot had impacted within the central scoring ring despite atmospheric conditions that should have introduced measurable deviation. The consistency defied statistical probability while demonstrating what dedicated training could achieve under optimal circumstances. Rodriguez found himself questioning whether he had witnessed actual events or experienced some form of elaborate hallucination. Chun accepted congratulations from fellow soldiers with quiet grace, apparently unaware that her achievement will be discussed throughout military marksmanship communities for decades. The morning had transformed routine qualification into legend, establishing new benchmarks for human performance that might never be equaled. Davies continued updating official records while struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. Morrison coordinated with base communications to notify appropriate commands about the record-breaking performance, recognizing that exceptional achievements required proper documentation and verification. Chen's score had obliterated existing standards while raising questions about training methods and individual capability that would influence military marksmanship doctrine. The implications extended far beyond simple record-keeping. The range gradually returned to normal operations as Chun departed with her equipment, leaving behind documentation that would be analyzed and verified through multiple command levels. Rodriguez began preparing his official report, while Davies secured all scoring materials in accordance with protocols for exceptional performances. The morning had established new definitions of possible achievement in military marksmanship. Bradley coordinated final documentation requirements while ensuring that all witness statements were properly recorded for historical verification. Chen's performance had transcended individual achievement to become institutional legend, establishing standards that would influence training programs and capability assessments throughout the military marksmanship community. Word of Chen's unprecedented performance spread through the base with the velocity of military gossip, reaching every unit and duty station before the lunch formation. Soldiers who had missed the morning's events gathered around witnesses, demanding detailed accounts of what had transpired on Range 7. The story grew with each retelling, though even the most conservative versions described achievements that challenged belief. Master Sergeant Thompson's memorial plaque drew unusual attention as soldiers compared the legendary record with Chen's performance, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed. 15 years of unchallenged supremacy had ended in a single morning session that redefined the boundaries of military marksmanship. The bronze nameplate that had symbolized ultimate achievement now represented a stepping stone to greater heights. Rodriguez spent the afternoon fielding calls from range masters across the military, each seeking verification of reports that seemed too extraordinary for accuracy. The official documentation package required multiple signatures and witness statements that would be scrutinized by marksmanship experts throughout the command structure. Chen's achievement had triggered administrative processes designed for exceptional circumstances. Davies reviewed his scorecards for the 20th time while preparing the formal report that would accompany Chen's record submission. 80 consecutive perfect shots represented mathematical consistency that defied probability calculations, yet the numbers remained unchanged despite intensive verification. The documentation would be forwarded through channels that extended to the highest levels of military command. The base shooting team gathered in emergency session to discuss implications of Chen's performance for their competitive programs. Coach Martinez struggled to comprehend how their training methods might be adapted to produce similar results, recognizing that Chen's achievement had established new benchmarks for human capability. The team's previous accomplishments seemed diminished by comparison to what had been demonstrated. Chen reported to her unit for normal duty assignments, apparently unaffected by the attention her morning's work had generated throughout the installation. Fellow soldiers regarded her with mixture of awe and curiosity, uncertain how to interact with someone who had just redefined excellence in their professional field. The quiet competence that had characterized her range performance extended to every aspect of her military bearing. Colonel Bradley convened a special staff meeting to coordinate response to media inquiries that were already arriving from military publications and marksmanship organizations. Chen's performance would attract attention from experts who would demand detailed analysis of techniques and equipment that had produced unprecedented results. The public affairs officer prepared statements that balanced accuracy with appropriate security considerations. Williams contacted the military marksmanship community to notify officials who would be responsible for verifying and recognizing Chen's achievement. The existing record structure had no provisions for scores that exceeded theoretical maximums by such significant margins, requiring revision of standards that had remained unchanged for decades. Chen had forced institutional adaptation to accommodate individual excellence. The range armorer completed detailed technical analysis of Chen's rifle and ammunition, searching for any factor that might explain performance beyond normal equipment capabilities. Standard military components had produced results that challenged manufacturer specifications, suggesting that exceptional skill could optimize performance beyond theoretical limitations. The weapon would be preserved as evidence supporting the official record claim. Morrison reviewed historical marksmanship records while preparing his witness statement for the formal documentation package. Chen's achievement represented not merely improvement over existing standards, but fundamental redefinition of what qualified personnel could accomplish with proper training and equipment. The implications would influence military marksmanship doctrine for generations. The mess hall buzzed with discussions of the morning's events as soldiers debated whether they had witnessed peak human performance or whether Chen's achievement represented a new baseline for exceptional marksmen. Training schedules were already being revised to incorporate lessons learned from observing perfect technique under pressure. Chen's influence was spreading beyond simple record-keeping. Range 7 was temporarily closed for detailed inspection and measurement verification that would support the official record submission. Every target had been preserved for analysis by experts who would scrutinize impact patterns and scoring accuracy. The documentation requirements for unprecedented achievement demanded preservation of evidence that could withstand the most intensive examination. Bradley coordinated with higher headquarters to establish timeline for formal recognition ceremonies that would acknowledge Chen's historic achievement. The military loved celebrating excellence, and Chen's performance provided opportunity for positive publicity that would benefit recruitment and morale initiatives. Plans were already developing for presentations that would showcase individual accomplishment within institutional frameworks. Evening formation brought unprecedented attention to Chen's unit as soldiers from across the base gathered to observe the person who had redefined excellence in military marksmanship. Her quiet professionalism contrasted sharply with the excitement surrounding her achievement, demonstrating the character traits that had enabled extraordinary performance under pressure. The official verification ceremony commenced 3 days later with representatives from Military Marksmanship Command arriving to witness formal documentation of Chen's unprecedented achievement. Brigadier General Hayes had flown in personally to oversee proceedings that would establish new standards for military shooting excellence. The ceremony location had been moved to the base auditorium to accommodate dignitaries and media representatives covering the historic recognition. Colonel Bradley opened the proceedings by reading the official citation that detailed Chen's perfect score of 400 points, achieved through 80 consecutive bullseye hits across multiple distances. The audience of fellow soldiers listened in respectful silence as the magnitude of her accomplishment was formally articulated for the record. Master Sergeant Thompson's family had been invited to witness the passing of his legendary status to a new generation. Rodriguez presented the detailed range documentation that verified every aspect of Chen's performance, including witness statements from multiple observers and technical analysis of equipment and conditions. The verification process had required 3 days of intensive review by experts who had scrutinized every detail of the historic session. General Hayes accepted the documentation package with ceremonial gravity appropriate for momentous occasions. Davies read aloud the shot-by-shot scoring record that chronicled Chen's progression through each distance phase, emphasizing the mathematical consistency that had produced perfection across increasingly challenging ranges. 80 consecutive perfect shots represented achievement that transcended individual excellence to demonstrate the outer limits of human capability. The precision required had never been sustained across such demanding conditions. Chun stood at attention while General Hayes reviewed the official scoring documents that would be forwarded to the Department of Defense for permanent recognition. Her uniform displayed the standard decorations of a competent soldier, providing no indication of the extraordinary skill that had redefined military marksmanship standards. The contrast between her modest appearance and historic achievement emphasized the unpredictable nature of exceptional performance. Williams presented his detailed spotting notes that confirmed the accuracy of every shot Chun had fired during the record session. His witness testimony carried particular weight due to his reputation for precision in target observation and his 20-year career in marksmanship instruction. The spotting records would be preserved as primary documentation supporting Chen's claim to military shooting immortality. The memorial plaque honoring Master Sergeant Thompson was ceremonially updated to reflect the new record holder, though Thompson's achievement remained prominently displayed as foundation for Chen's historic performance. The bronze nameplate would serve as inspiration for future marksmen, while acknowledging the evolution of human capability through dedicated training and exceptional skill. Thompson's widow expressed pride that her husband's record had been surpassed by such worthy successor. Morrison detailed the technical analysis that had verified Chen's equipment as standard military issue, eliminating any suggestion that specialized modifications had contributed to her unprecedented accuracy. The rifle and ammunition had performed within manufacturer specifications while producing results that challenged theoretical limitations. Chen's achievement represented optimization of human skill rather than technological advancement. General Hayes announced that Chen's performance would be documented in official military marksmanship records and distributed throughout the training command as example of achievable excellence. Her techniques would be analyzed and incorporated into instruction programs designed to elevate overall shooting standards across military forces. The ripple effects of individual excellence would influence thousands of future marksmen. The audience rose in sustained applause as Chun received formal recognition for achievements that had redefined the boundaries of military marksmanship. Her quiet acceptance of honors reflected the professional character that had enabled extraordinary performance under pressure. The ceremony concluded with presentation of awards that would accompany her throughout a career marked by unprecedented accomplishment. Photography sessions documented the historic transfer of marksmanship supremacy from Thompson's legacy to Chen's active achievement. The images would be preserved in military archives, while supporting publicity campaigns that celebrated individual excellence within institutional frameworks. Chen's story would inspire recruitment efforts and training programs for decades. Base personnel filed past to offer personal congratulations to the soldier who had elevated their installation's reputation through individual achievement. Chen's responses remained characteristically modest, despite accomplishing something that would be discussed throughout military marksmanship communities for generations. Her performance had transformed routine qualification into legend that would outlive everyone present. The transformation in attitudes toward Chun became immediately apparent following the formal recognition ceremony, with soldiers who had initially dismissed her capabilities now seeking opportunities to learn from her techniques. Rodriguez approached her after the ceremony to request assistance in developing advanced marksmanship curricula that could incorporate lessons learned from her unprecedented performance. The range master who had questioned her shooting ability now regarded her as the ultimate authority on precision marksmanship. Davies abandoned his skeptical demeanor entirely, replacing doubt with genuine admiration for achievements that had redefined his understanding of human capability. The instructor who had predicted her failure now studied his detailed notes from her record session, searching for technical insights that might improve his own teaching methods. His conversion from doubter to believer exemplified the broader shift in perception that followed Chen's historic demonstration. Williams requested permission to document Chen's shooting techniques for inclusion in official training manuals that would be distributed throughout the military marksmanship community. The spotter who had called out 80 consecutive perfect hits recognized that he had witnessed something that would influence instruction methods for decades. His detailed observations would become foundational material for advanced shooting programs. Colonel Bradley authorized the creation of specialized training programs based on analysis of Chen's methods, recognizing that her achievement represented more than individual excellence. The base commander, who had initially viewed her performance with administrative concern, now saw opportunity to establish his installation as the premier center for marksmanship instruction. Chen's success would attract resources and attention that would benefit the entire military community. Morrison began developing case studies that would analyze every aspect of Chen's performance for integration into officer education programs. The former skeptic now understood that her achievement demonstrated principles applicable far beyond shooting sports, including dedication, preparation, and execution under pressure. Military academies would study her methods as examples of peak performance across multiple disciplines. The base shooting team restructured their entire training program around techniques observed during Chen's record session, though they recognized that replicating her level of consistency might prove impossible. Coach Martinez incorporated her breathing patterns, equipment preparation, and mental approach into curriculum designed to elevate overall team performance. Chen's influence was spreading throughout competitive shooting programs. Thompson's widow approached Chen during the reception following the ceremony, expressing gratitude that her husband's record had been surpassed by someone who demonstrated similar dedication and character. The passing of marksmanship supremacy from one generation to the next represented continuity in military excellence that transcended individual achievement. Chen accepted the blessing with characteristic humility that had marked every aspect of her performance. General Hayes announced plans to feature Chen's achievement in recruiting campaigns designed to attract high-quality personnel to military service. Her story would be used to demonstrate opportunities for individual excellence within institutional frameworks, appealing to candidates who sought challenges that would test their ultimate capabilities. The public affairs value of her accomplishment extended far beyond marksmanship circles. Range 7 was formally designated as a historic site commemorating Chen's unprecedented performance, with plans for permanent displays that would educate future soldiers about the achievement that had redefined military shooting standards. The facility where she had written history would serve as inspiration for countless marksmen who would train there in coming years. Her legacy was being institutionalized for permanent preservation. Media representatives who had covered the ceremony began preparing feature articles that would spread Chen's story throughout military publications and civilian shooting sports magazines. Her achievement would be analyzed by experts seeking to understand the combination of factors that had produced such extraordinary results. The technical aspects of her performance would be studied and debated for years. Fellow soldiers who had witnessed her record session found themselves elevated in status simply through association with historic events, their presence during the legendary performance making them part of military folklore. Veterans would tell stories of the morning they watched impossible accuracy become reality, their witness testimony adding credibility to accounts that might otherwise seem exaggerated. Chen had created shared memory that would last lifetimes. The mess hall conversations that evening centered entirely on Chen's achievement and its implications for military training programs, with animated discussions of technique and equipment that reflected new appreciation for marksmanship excellence. Soldiers who had never shown interest in competitive shooting began inquiring about range time and instruction opportunities. Chen's influence was inspiring broader participation in shooting sports throughout the installation. 6 months after her record-breaking performance, Chen had become the most requested instructor in military marksmanship programs, with requests for her expertise arriving from installations worldwide. The soldier who had been questioned about basic shooting ability now served as senior advisor for advanced training curricula that would influence thousands of future marksmen. Her quiet competence had evolved into recognized authority that commanded respect throughout military shooting communities. Rodriguez transformed Range 7 into a premier training facility that attracted elite marksmen seeking to learn from the location where history had been written. The range master who had asked if she could even shoot now introduced visiting dignitaries to the spot where Chun had achieved perfection. His initial skepticism had been replaced by pride in having witnessed something that would be discussed for generations. The updated record board displayed Chen's achievement prominently above Thompson's legacy, creating a visual representation of evolving excellence that inspired every soldier who trained at the facility. Davies maintained the display with reverence appropriate for military shrine, his role as keeper of marksmanship history now extending beyond simple record-keeping. The numbers that had once seemed impossible were permanently etched in bronze for future inspiration. Williams published detailed analysis of Chen's techniques in the official military marksmanship manual, his observations becoming required reading for instructor certification programs. The spotter who had verified 80 consecutive perfect hits had become recognized expert on precision shooting, his credibility enhanced by association with historic achievement. His documentation would educate marksmen for decades to come. Base shooting teams across the military adopted training methods derived from analysis of Chen's performance, though none had yet approached her level of consistency. The techniques that had produced perfect accuracy were being studied and adapted by coaches seeking to elevate their programs beyond previous limitations. Chen's influence was spreading throughout competitive shooting at every level. Colonel Bradley used Chen's achievement as centerpiece for leadership development programs that emphasized the power of individual excellence to transform institutional culture. The commander who had initially worried about administrative complications now celebrated how one soldier's dedication had elevated his entire installation's reputation. Military academies studied her story as example of peak performance principles. Morrison incorporated lessons from Chen's achievement into strategic planning courses that examined how exceptional individual capability could influence broader organizational effectiveness. The officer who had witnessed mathematical impossibility become reality now taught future leaders about the importance of recognizing and nurturing extraordinary talent. Chen's impact extended far beyond marksmanship into fundamental military leadership doctrine. Chun continued her regular duties with characteristic professionalism, apparently unaffected by the attention her achievement had generated throughout military and civilian shooting communities. She accepted requests for instruction and consultation with the same quiet competence that had enabled her historic performance. The fame that might have changed others had no visible effect on her approach to military service. Thompson's memorial had been expanded to include recognition of Chen's achievement, creating a shrine to marksmanship excellence that honored both past and present standards. Visitors from around the world made pilgrimages to the site where two legends had established benchmarks for human capability. The location had become sacred ground for anyone serious about precision shooting. General Hayes featured Chen's story in his keynote address at the International Military Marksmanship Conference, using her achievement to demonstrate American military training excellence to representatives from allied nations. The performance that had begun with a skeptical question about basic shooting ability was now being used to showcase military capability on the world stage. Chun had become an ambassador for American marksmanship excellence. Range 7 hosted its first annual Chun marksmanship competition, attracting elite shooters who sought to test themselves against standards she had established. The event generated international attention while providing venue for advancing shooting sports at the highest levels. Chen's legacy was creating opportunities for future generations to pursue excellence in precision marksmanship. The question of whether anyone could even shoot had been answered definitively through demonstration of what dedicated training and exceptional skill could accomplish. Chen's quiet confidence had been validated by performance that redefined the boundaries of human capability, transforming skepticism into respect that would last throughout her career. Her achievement proved that extraordinary things remained possible for those willing to pursue perfection with unwavering dedication. Have you ever had to prove yourself against impossible odds? Whether in your career, education, or personal challenges, there's something powerful about that moment when doubt transforms into respect. Share your story of overcoming skepticism in the comments below.